Drop in altitude to the hypotenuse, hypotenuse, hypotenuse. Drop in altitude to the hypotenuse and get three gongs that look alike. That altitude is very mean, whether you know it or not. Proportionally, it's in between the segments of the hypot. Oh, and then the chorus, and then many other verses after that.
Welcome to Second Act Stories, a podcast that profiles people who have made major life and career changes and are pursuing more rewarding lives in a second act. I'm your host for this episode, Scott Merritt.
And I'm Andy Levine, also with Second Act Stories, and Scott's sidekick for this episode. So tell us, Scott, who is singing this geometry song, and what's the story behind it?
The guy singing that song is Joe Gladstone. Joe spent 31 years as a high school math teacher. He set his lessons to music to help his students retain complicated concepts, and this is just one of the many songs he sang. It's also an interesting glimpse into where he ultimately wound up.
All right, so tell us where he wound up and what his second act is all about.
Well, today, Joe is a highly sought-after freelance stage manager who works with some of the most acclaimed opera houses all over the country.
All right, let's hear his story.
So let's talk about where you came from. Where were you born? What was your background?
Well, I was born in Manhattan, actually, and my parents moved to Queens 2 months after I was born. And I grew up in Laurelton in Queens, spent my entire childhood there, and then Queens College and Stony Brook University.
Joe's parents wanted him to be a doctor, so once he graduated from high school at the age of 16, he set off for Queens College, where he studied pre-med. Briefly. It was a tough conversation, but he let his parents know that he was changing his major to communications with the hope to eventually work as a television director. How did you make the move from studying communications to education, winding up teaching high school math?
Well, when I graduated, it was my senior year was 68, 69, and the Vietnam War was at its height. It was the year before the lottery, and I would have been 1A if I graduated with a degree in communications, arts, and sciences, and I really did not want to be part of that war. So I knew people who were deferred because they were teachers. And I had a wonderful friend who was a teacher in Syosset. So I called him and spoke to him. And he said, well, I can get you an interview at Syosset. So he told me who to contact to get an interview at Syosset. And I went. They hired me in Syosset as a sub, so I was still 1A.
Joe got the job as a math teacher at Syosset High School. His lottery position dropped way down, and he was never drafted into the Army. His career trajectory was now firm. This is really a story of passion, as most second acts are. What was your first passion?
My first passion, I guess, was music. I love music. My mother taught me piano. She was a wonderful concert pianist, and she taught me piano, classical piano. And I loved it, and we would play four hands together, which I still love to this day. She also played for theater companies, and I would go with her to rehearsal when I was a kid. I was in some shows, some musicals, and I also played piano for some musicals. And then I tried directing also. I directed for some community theaters, and in teaching, I directed the senior musical for the first 10 years that I taught. But then eventually I tried stage managing when somebody we knew asked me if I would like to stage manage a company that my wife was acting in. And that was sort of my entree into stage managing, which I then really loved, and that became my passion.
So on the one hand, you have this background in music and this passion for theater. On the other hand, you're in the classroom teaching math, which seem like they're diametrically completely opposite of one another.
There is a high correlation between math and music is mathematical and in certain ways. And luckily, I was paired up with a teacher, and we team taught calculus together, who was very musical. For many topics, he wrote songs about the topics to help teach the kids, which was just so much fun for us to sing. They sang it, and to this day, a lot of those kids still remember those songs.
So naturally, I'm dying to hear what one of these songs sounds like.
Okay, well, I can remember many of them, but one of the most fun ones talked about mean proportionals in triangles, and it went something like this. Drop an altitude to the hypotenuse, hypotenuse, hypotenuse. Drop an altitude to the hypotenuse and get three gons that look alike. That altitude is very mean, whether you know it or not. Proportionally, it's in between the segments of the hypot. Oh, and then the chorus, and then many other verses after that. But that was a fun song, and we wailed, and kids loved it, and we'd get up and shout it out. So we had good times singing.
Seemingly a great way to engage an audience that's easy to lose in a math classroom.
Absolutely right.
How did you move outside the confines of the school building and into community theater? Because that seems like an awful big commitment.
Well, part was through my wife when they needed a stage manager. But I remember in the very beginning, through one of my students who was in the first play that I directed, which was the end of the year before I started with the senior plays, I got friendly with her and her family, and her mother would invite me for dinner. But they were members of the local synagogue in Syosset, and they knew that they needed a pianist. So they asked me if I was interested, and I said, sure. And then it just went from there, and another student knew they were looking for also a musical director in another studio, another theater in Lindenhurst. And that's actually where I met my wife. So that turned out very well.
So all the while, though, you're still getting up early in the morning, teaching classes all day.
5:30 in the morning every day, teaching classes, tutoring in the afternoon, going to rehearsals every night, and then going to the diner till 1 o'clock in the morning, and then getting up at 5:30.
So how truly did you juggle it all?
We just did it. We had fun. We always say that we did shows so that we could go to the diner, and it was a tremendous social aspect to that. So we had a ball doing it.
All right. So you were now scratching this theater itch in community theater, as well as at the high school. You're how many years into teaching when all of a sudden there's something that happens that drives you away from teaching?
At the beginning, I thought I would teach till I was 26, and at 26, at that time, you were no longer eligible for the draft, and then I thought I would go back to TV. But I loved teaching, loved the kids, loved math, loved Syosset High School, loved my department. We had a bunch of people that we all grew up together. We were a family. It was marvelous. Until 2000, 2001.
We'll get back to Joe's story and find out what happened in 2001 after this short message from our new sponsor, the Daily Job Hunt and Crash.co.
Hey, just wanted to chime in real quick. This is Joel, and my second act story is I worked for 10 years in education and in classical music, and just this past year, I made a big switch into the private sector at a startup company doing what makes me come alive, and that is working for the Daily Job Hunt by Crash.co. I write a daily email with quick tips and inspirations on how to land a job without a resume, to creatively stand out, take charge, forge your path, and make your life happen. So definitely want to encourage you to check that out. This is crash.co, crash.co. Even if you're not on the job hunt, it's a real short, snappy email that could be really valuable for you. Again, that's crash.co, crash.co. All right, let's go back to the show.
In 2001, a new chairman was hired to oversee the math department. That was the beginning of what led to Joe's departure from teaching.
He micromanaged everything, which we never had. He had the people skills of a piece of paper. I was heavily invested into theater also. And at that time, my daughter was a senior in high school, was about to go off to college. And I knew that if I quit teaching and went into theater and had to travel, it would be okay. So I just made the decision. It was a bold decision. And I just said to my wife, I'm out of here.
Tell me a little bit about what actually went through your head when you were looking at this decision face to face.
My attitude is just do it. I don't worry about it. I just go ahead and do it. And I know that by doing that, I will do my best to be successful. There were people who helped me through their contacts. It started off slowly. Financially, I had a little nest egg that was okay to get me through, so I didn't really worry about that. And I just did it. I just went and said, this is my decision. I am now no longer a teacher. I'm a stage manager.
How long did it take to establish yourself in the world of theater?
I was lucky that I had the connections to get me started, but then I really had to work on my own, and I sent tons of resumes to all the companies, theater companies, opera companies. Right now I work for mostly opera companies. And what turned me on to that was in approximately 1998, while I was still teaching, I was stage managing also in the evening for a group called the Village Light Opera Group. They were a wonderful group, and Lydia, my wife, happened to get the lead in their show. I went with her to a party, a casting party, and the people were wonderful there. And I said to Lydia, see if they need a stage manager. So she asked, and they did. And the next day I was their stage manager. This is while I was still teaching. It was at night, and I loved it. One of the people associated with that group knew somebody else who had his own opera company. That company needed a stage manager. So he recommended me, and I went for an interview. I got the job, and it was wonderful. And once I was out there and worked in different places, you work for different directors. Those different directors work for different places. And if they like you, they recommend you.
Joe started working for more and more opera companies as a freelance stage manager. He enjoyed working with a variety of different directors and traveling the country. And he found a home in the world of opera.
I had done a lot of big musicals, loaded with sets, constantly changing in musicals, and it was pretty tough, and there was a lot to do, constantly calling cues. In opera, it turned out that many operas just have one set or one set per act. For example, let's just say Madame Butterfly is all one set with a couple little things coming in and out. So nothing to worry about except lights and costumes and still many other things. So I was so happy about that because it was so much easier until I did a production of Mozart's The Magic Flute. That was like a musical with a ton of things happening. So there I was back into the, quote, musical theater world, although it was wonderful, but not every opera is like that.
Let's take a minute to define what a stage manager does. Nothing happens during a live performance without the stage manager calling a cue. Music doesn't start playing, actors don't enter the stage, lights don't go on or off, props aren't placed where they need to be, set pieces don't move, crew members aren't where they need to be backstage, curtains don't raise. Every aspect of the live performance is the stage manager's responsibility.
Places, please, ladies and gentlemen of the chorus, to the stage. Places, please, Mr. Burton, Mr. Rogers.
Think of him as an air traffic controller who also has to juggle lit torches while spinning hula hoops on all his extremities. And in opera, he also has to be able to read music proficiently, because his book is essentially the score and every single cue is tied to a specific note. It's really, really complicated. What are the traits that make a good stage manager?
It's all about making people happy. The tech is secondary. It's about people and making sure everything moves for the director and rehearsals and the tech process and making sure all the singers are happy. And you work with quite a diverse number of personalities in the professional opera world. What I've found is when people are high maintenance, giving them what they want makes the job very easy and makes things go smoothly.
All right. So here you are in a new field, second act that you've become successful in, and you absolutely are adoring. And then March 2020 happens.
Yeah.
And suddenly live performance is like the worst thing in the world. What happened?
I was in Annapolis, Maryland, in a company that I work with on and off since 2002 or 2003. It's a wonderful company that I love. It's family. The same two men ran the company. One was the director and one was the conductor. I loved those two men. They were retiring that year after being with the company for many, many, many years. We were doing a production of Carlisle Floyd's Susanna, which is an opera in English, and it's a marvelous, gorgeous, glorious opera. We had a cast to die for, and they were all marvelous singers. So we were well on our way to performances. We were in our final orchestra dress. So I was at the gym during the day, and I got a phone call from the general director of the company, and she said to me, "How soon can you be here?" I said, "Well, I'm at the gym. It's a half hour away. I could be there in a half hour." So she said, "Come in." So I drove in, and when she got there, she told me that they were shutting down. We were devastated. We all cried for many reasons. First, because after all the work and toil and sweat and tears that you put in and this magnificent production that we were going to have, it was cut off. So I went home that night, and that was it. And there was no work, and there was no work for anybody for months after, for 16 months after. So it was very, very sad.
What should anyone looking to establish themselves in theater know about the process?
It's all networking. I had a lot of growing up to do, even though I was older. I thought that I knew everything about stage managing. I didn't, and it was a tremendous learning experience. That took a long time, and I feel like I'm talking about the job of what stage managing is all about. And there's so much paperwork that goes on that I didn't know anything about, and I was thrust into it with experienced assistant stage managers who looked at me like I was crazy because I was the stage manager and didn't know what was going on, and I learned from them. Networking, learn everything. It's most people don't take my route. Most people study it. I did not study it. Most people may intern and learn by interning. I would say whatever experience you can get by interning and listening and working with stage managers, take it.
I asked Joe about the satisfaction he gets from stage managing operas as compared to teaching math.
It's just so emotional when things go well. And when the curtain comes in and when the audience stands up, gives you a standing ovation, and when you hear the symphony orchestra playing Mozart, the famous overture from The Marriage of Figaro, for example, and you hear a professional orchestra play that, my insides run over with emotion, which didn't happen in teaching. I mean, I loved, and it was fun to teach, but it's totally, the emotions are totally different.
So during a production, where's the stage manager situated?
It depends. In most musical theater, the stage manager is up above the balcony there somewhere and looking down through a window from the back of the house all the way to the front. And that's how it is in musical theater. In opera, for some reason, it isn't. He's usually off on stage right or stage left, right off the stage, backstage, which I much prefer because then if things go wrong, I have control that way too. And I have 2 TV monitors. One is a monitor of the maestro conducting, because lots of light cues have to happen on cutoffs. So as I see him cut off, I have to call the cue. It's always in anticipation. The second TV monitor is of the stage, because if I'm sitting off stage on the side, I can't see everything. There's curtains and to delineate the wings there. So most of the time, I'm just on stage right or stage left, wherever that particular theater has the stage manager console set up.
So you don't get to actually experience the fruits of all your labors.
And that is so true. And that is one of the negatives of doing this. I never actually see it in person, but it's still a thrill for me, even though I'm not watching it from the front. It's a tremendous thrill to know that everybody else is watching it.
After sitting down with Joe Gladstone for this interview, I had a few observations about his story that relate to virtually any career journey. Number 1, leadership is a transferable skill. It's impossible to ignore Joe's confident charm and his charismatic personality. These qualities are essential to commanding the attention of a room full of high school students, equally as well as running an entire crew for a large-scale opera production. Number 2, good communication improves outcomes, always. As a math teacher, Joe communicated complex lessons by making songs out of them, and his entire job as a stage manager in his second act career is rooted in good communication. And number 3, a combination of passion and tenacity leads to success. When Joe got his first job as a professional stage manager, he didn't know what he didn't know. His lack of experience was evident, but rather than giving up, he learned, adapted, and grew, and he quickly earned a solid reputation as a stage manager people wanted to work with. We hope you'll keep listening and subscribe to Second Act Stories on your favorite podcast app. Like us on Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn, and share us with your friends. Stay tuned, there are more Second Act Stories just around the corner.